This was the worst case of police corruption ever.
They accused me of giving information to Gambino people.
The abuse of power was almost unbelievable. It was a betrayal of the badge.
The feds say Ippolito and Caracappa, while working for the NYPD, actually moonlighted as mafia hitmen.
I didn't believe it. He was a decorated cop. He was in newspapers for making arrests.
They're charged with 8 murders.
They had no motivation other than to make money.
Today, another man turned up dead in the trunk of a car. The 6th victim in less than a week, murdered gangland style.
It was the biggest scandal in the history of the NYPD.
I was a New York City detective for 23 years. We don't go around killing people.
Did he become a cop knowing he wanted to do good for people? Did he become a cop knowing he could help the mafia? I don't know.
Over 12 police officers will soon be facing federal indictments.
This was the worst case of police corruption ever.
The cops were charged with stealing over $1 million in taxpayer funds.
I went from putting handcuffs on people to having handcuffs put on me.
In the 1970s and 80s, New York City was broken down, burning, and nearly bankrupt. Residents had a nickname for it. They called it Fear City.
Crime is on the increase. The latest figures show felonies at their highest level since last March.
It was a war on the streets. It was like Fallujah in many neighborhoods. It was an extremely dangerous place.
Much of the violence was linked to the mob.
The mafia had strangleholds in the garment district. It had strangleholds on various industries, the bars and restaurants, and they had no qualms about having people killed.
27 people have been eliminated in what looks like gangland rubouts.
The main crime families in those days were the Gambinos, Lucchese, Colombo, Genovese, and Veneno. You pretty much couldn't name a type of criminal activity in New York City that one of the 5 families was not involved in. They were just an integral part of the landscape in New York City.
Well, there's been another mob hit on the streets of Brooklyn.
Victims of apparent gangland-style rubouts. The latest casualty was found in the trunk of a late-model Oldsmobile.
With crime spiraling out of control, the NYPD started quickly losing cops.
The police department was desperate for people, and they were desperate for tough guys who knew how to fight, and Detective Louis Ippolito was one of those people.
My name is Louis Ippolito, and I'm the son of Louis Ippolito Sr. My dad's father was Ralph Ippolito. His mafia name was Fat the Gangster. My grandfather, he was tough. If you were disrespecting him or doing something wrong, you're gonna get it. He was totally against cops. Totally not into cops. I want nothing to do with it. FBI meant forever bother Italians. So it seems odd that my father, growing up with that family, would want to become a cop. My uncles were part of the Gambino family, and when I was less than 10 years old, my uncle and cousin, there was a hit put on them. They got, they were murdered. And that's the first time I knew something was different with the family. My father was not sure what to do and where to go with his life. And my grandmother told him, why don't you go take the test to be a cop? Why don't you go try it out and go do that? It's a steady city job. You'll have all the good stuff and everything. And then he took the test and he passed and he got it.
In his rookie year at the police academy, Ippolito trained next to Stephen Caracappa, a Staten Island native who'd been arrested for burglary in his teenage years, but went on to serve in the Army.
At that time in the late 60s, men were in Vietnam and there was a police shortage and crime was crazy. So I think it was easier to get into the NYPD.
After graduating in '69, the two went their separate ways. Caracappa became part of a narcotics squad. Ippolito was a beat cop.
Eppolito worked in Brooklyn at the 63rd Precinct, right in the heart of where a lot of the activity of organized crime was going on.
So he was not somebody sat behind a desk. He was out there making arrests.
I was very proud of my dad. People liked him. He wasn't afraid of anything. He would take anything on, anybody on.
Louis Eppolito was an avid bodybuilder, a garrulous, big, bulky sort of guy who was very chummy and talkative.
My father was, the big muscles, and he got Mr. New York City in 1967. Awards meant a lot to my dad. He had a big ego, and he loved the attention. After he became a cop, my mother said, the girls would flock around him and all that kind of stuff. So I guess it was inevitable that they divorced. So I went with my mom, and we lived in another apartment in Brooklyn, and my dad got his own place. He would pick me up, or I'd go see him, and he'd put on the 11 o'clock news, and there he is, on there for making some kind of arrest. It was really something special. It was good.
10 years after joining the department, Eppolito and Caracappa were assigned to become a team. By now, each was a detective with very different styles.
Detective Caracappa had a nickname, The Undertaker, because of his appearance, which was that he spent a lot of time inside as opposed to other detectives who would prefer to be outside. Detective Eppolito was much more of a street cop than Detective Caracappa was. Detective Eppolito was very loud, big personality. Detective Caracappa was very quiet, very discreet, very discerning. They were polar opposites in terms of personality.
Louis Eppolito's connection to organized crime was through his relatives, who were part of the Gambino crime family. Caracappa had no familial connection to any of the organized crime families. He gravitated more towards the federal joint NYPD task force that existed at the time, where they would investigate large, major crime cases and major cases.
Detective Caracappa had access to a tremendous volume of confidential and important information about organized crime.
After only a year as partners, the duo moved to different precincts. Caracappa stayed in narcotics but worked undercover. Eppolito continued to make connections as a beat cop on the streets. In 1984, an FBI raid on the home of Mafia Lieutenant Rosario Gambino uncovered evidence that cast a cloud of suspicion on the two former partners. Questions began swirling about whether they had been trading secrets with the mob.
There were police reports found in Rosario Gambino's residence, which were confidential and which come from the 63rd Precinct, where Detective Eppolito was working, and which had Detective Eppolito's fingerprints on it. The evidence seemed pretty overwhelming that he was involved.
My mom woke me up. I was sleeping, and she told me, "Don't get upset, but your dad was suspended from the police force." I asked my dad, "Dad, what happened?" My father said he handles all different kinds of paperwork in the precinct, and his fingerprints could be on anything. He said, "I'm going to hear things on the TV, on the news, and it's not true." He swore up and down he didn't leak in information to these Gambino guys. And I 100% stood by his side.
Detective Eppolito was brought before the internal police department court for investigation and prosecution. He was acquitted of the charges of providing this information to an organized crime figure. He was fully reinstated.
So he got put back on the force. I think there was a change in my dad after that. But he knew that there were suspicions and talk about him behind his back. He would tell me that, either call him names or say he's a gangster or this or that. He was still doing his job, but it seemed like his heart wasn't in it like it used to be. And he had a lot of angst. He didn't seem the same. And that's when things went bad. My dad was the 11th most decorated cop in the city. But after his suspension, I seen a difference in him. I think he was more pissed off about things than anything else. He knew that there were suspicions and talk about the whole mafia gangster thing. At that time, it didn't make me suspicious. Even though that side of my family did this or that, I didn't think he would have been part of that. And I refused to believe it.
Louis Eppolito did close cases, and he did investigations. And he was a worker. That's not the question. The question is whether he was actually doing the work of the NYPD as well as helping individuals within organized crime.
By the mid-1980s, the feds began to crack down on the mafia. As the pressure mounted, the mobsters started to turn on each other. For the Gambino and the Lucchese families, the conflict turned into an all-out war.
In the hierarchy of organized crime, the Lucchese crime family was an important part of the hierarchy. And Anthony Gaspipe Casa was a power in the Lucchese crime family. He was a killer, and he had no qualms about having people killed.
He basically beat somebody up with a gas, like the black gas pipe that you find. I don't know if he killed the guy, but he actually, he severely beaten him. That's how he got that name. At that time, there was a hit conducted on Anthony Casso. He was in a vehicle, waiting to meet with somebody, and another vehicle drove by and shot at him multiple times. He was hurt during the hit, but he managed to escape and got into one of the buildings close by and notified, for assistance from his crew.
Mr. Casso was extremely angry that someone had dared to shoot him and was completely obsessed with this idea of exacting revenge. And he eventually turned to Bert Kaplan.
Casso and Kaplan met through the neighborhood. Kaplan was a multi-ton marijuana dealer who became what's called an associate of organized crime.
Mr. Kaplan told Mr. Casso, I know somebody who can perhaps get us the information about whom the police suspected were involved in the shooting. And he eventually turned to someone named Frank Santoro.
Frank Santoro's cousin was Louis Eppolito.
It wasn't long before Santoro came back with news. His informant in the police department gave him the name of the Gambino associates they believed had done the job.
The names of who conducted the hit on Anthony Casso were Eddie Lino, Jimmy Heidel, and Nicky Guido.
Casso wasn't one to forgive. He quickly plotted revenge.
Mr. Casso was told that Eddie Lino, who was a high-ranking member of the Gambino family, had actually okayed the attack on Anthony Casso. Eddie Lino shot him several times on the side of the road and killed him.
Sometime later, Jimmy Heidel disappears, and he's never heard from again.
After that, Mr. Casso dispatched some of his soldiers to kill Nicholas Guido.
It was Christmas Day, and at that time, Nicky was showing his uncle a brand new car that he had gotten. A drive-by shooting took place, and Nicky Guido was killed. Unfortunately, it wasn't the right Nicky Guido. This Nicky Guido that was killed on Christmas Day was an innocent victim. He wasn't involved in organized crime. He wasn't involved in the hit against Casso.
At this point, you'd heard the initial allegations about Louis Ippolito and Caracappa passing information that led to the deaths of other people. This creates an interlocking series of events. Everything is coming together to make a critical mass and eventually explode into this nuclear blast.
By 1990, detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa had worn the badge of the New York City Police Department for over 20 years. For at least half of that time, they dodged suspicion they were helping the mob.
Well, you'd heard the initial allegations involving corruption, but then that didn't develop into anything. So, after a while, they sort of passed from the screen.
And eventually, they had their time in, and they were able to retire from the NYPD. Ippolito retired to Las Vegas in the early 1990s.
He was really done with the whole cop thing. He was in early 40s. He wanted to wipe his hands of it and go on a whole new life change. In Las Vegas, he had this big, beautiful home, and living on a cop's pension. I was like, all right, I didn't ask questions, but in my mind, I was a little put off with the whole thing.
Ippolito kept in touch with his former partner. 2 years later, Caracappa retired and moved across the street.
It was definitely weird that your partner from Brooklyn from years ago would be living across the street from you, 3,000 miles away. I did ask my dad, and he told me he's a friend of mine. Got him a good home, a good price. So I kind of brushed it off as just nonchalant, nothing much of it. It wasn't until later on that made sense now why.
Caracappa was content to enjoy a quiet life in Vegas, but Ippolito wanted to be a part of the glamour and the glitz.
He was done with the NYPD, that I know for sure. He wanted to write movies and be in movies, and he did.
Ippolito played a role in the mafia movie Goodfellas, and he was introduced as somebody that's involved in organized crime.
He was, I think his name was Fat Andy, or something like that. He told me he was friendly with Robert De Niro and all the people on the set and everything.
Ippolito also wrote a book called Mafia Cop. And the theme, of course, was that he had to overcome the stigma of the mafia to become a successful cop and forge a great career as a police officer. The great irony in this case was that Louis Ippolito's book led to his downfall.
Lou knows the ins and outs of the mafia. Why? His father and his uncle were an instrumental part of it. By the time Lou was 12 years old, he was aware that his father killed people for a living. When you said, I wanted to be a cop, didn't anyone take you aside and say you didn't inherit that mantle?
Oh, sure. They've all told me you're crazy. What do you want to do that for? Again, I was a very tough guy. I called the guy up to lock him up. I put a shotgun in his mouth.
You opened someo's mouth and put a shotgun?
I stuck it down his mouth. He did. And
He did?
I cocked the gun barrel, and he wet himself. His stain was getting bigger and bigger.
Gee, I can't imagine why.
While Ippolito was basking in his newfound fame, a woman in New York City was making a terrible connection between him and her long-dead son.
It so happened that one of the viewers of the program was Betty Heidel, the mother of Jimmy Heidel, who had disappeared after the hit on Queso. And she seemed to recognize Louis Ippolito as a guy many years earlier who had come looking for her son.
She recalled seeing Ippolito and another individual in front of the house. at the same time that Jimmy Heidel goes missing. She starts putting two and two together, and what happens is she goes out and buys that book that Ippolito wrote. As she's paging through the book, there's a photograph of another individual in there. The photograph of that other individual is Stephen Caracappa. So Betty Heidel calls the NYPD cold case squad and says, these are the guys that were involved in possibly my son's disappearance. You need to look into them. There's an investigation that gets started that starts looking into Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa.
If he didn't do that show, the Brooklyn DA's office might not have been energized to pick the Jimmy Heidel missing person case back up. So that did not do him any favors, because that ended up being sort of the impetus to everything turning.
While the Brooklyn DA followed up on the Heidel case, the FBI was launching their own investigation into the retired cops from another angle.
At that time, Anthony Casso was incarcerated on FBI charges as being the underboss of the Lucchese crime family. So Casso wanted to get out of jail.
Mr. Casso told the federal prosecutors that he had this blockbuster information about two detectives who were allegedly passing information to the mafia.
It was at that point that he fingered Louis Ippolito and Caracappa as his contacts with the mob.
Unfortunately, the U.S. Attorney's Office had taken a very firm position that Mr. Casso was not a reliable witness. So what we did was we built our case based on corroboration.
And the only other individual that can corroborate the information that Casso had provided was Herb Kaplan.
Kaplan was in jail from a drug conviction, and feds thought that, well, we could possibly get him to flip and corroborate a lot of stuff and tell us what he knew about the mafia cops.
So they immediately approached Mr. Kaplan, tried to get him to cooperate. He told them politely, as he was always polite, he wasn't interested, and he would never talk to them.
Kaplan was a very hard, old-time gangster. He believed in the code. Whatever he did was between him and them, and that he wasn't going to rat his friends out.
But eventually, the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office became aware that there might be an opportunity where Mr. Kaplan would change his mind.
Kaplan might have been a mobster, but he also loved his family. And that loyalty to his family finally caused him to break the mob code.
His daughter had recently had a child, was very eager for him to enjoy his grandchild. Mr. Kaplan's wife and daughter had repeatedly, many, many times throughout the years, asked him to do whatever he could do in order to get himself out of prison. So he eventually decided to cooperate.
Finally, investigators had someone who could corroborate the accusations against the mafia cops.
We understood at the time that it was a big break, but we did not understand at the time the volume of information that he had.
Former New York City detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa planned to live out their retirement years in Vegas. But in 2003, investigators with the DEA, the FBI, and the Brooklyn DA's office finally had an informant to bring down the former cops.
Herb Kaplan was the linchpin of the entire investigation and prosecution. It was not possible to bring the case without him.
Kaplan's explosive allegation: the detectives didn't just offer information to the mob, they also did their dirty work.
Mr. Kaplan told us that Mr. Casso asks Detectives Caracappa and Detective Ippolito to pick up Jimmy Heidel. So Detectives Ippolito and Caracappa staked out Jimmy Heidel, found him, kidnapped him, had him put in the trunk of a car, delivered the car to Mr. Casso. Mr. Casso tortured Mr. Heidel, killed him, and somehow disposed of the body.
Sometime later, Eddie Lino was pulled over by Caracappa and Ippolito Ippolito and Caracappa came to the driver's side window, and it was at that time Caracappa shot Eddie Leno multiple times.
For murdering Jimmy Heidel, they were paid $25,000 and $5,000 bonus. And for murdering Eddie Leno, they were paid $65,000. A further offer was made to Mr. Casso from the detectives to find out more information about where Nicholas Guido was located. The detectives said they wanted another $4,000 for that.
So Stephen Caracappa ran Nicky Guido through the databases of the NYPD. He came up with several individuals matching that description.
So Mr. Casso dispatched some of his soldiers to kill Nicholas Guido, and of course, we know that the wrong person was killed.
Kaplan said that they were involved in 7, 8, possibly 9 murders.
This was the worst case of police abuse in the history of New York City, without question. So we wanted to figure out how we were going to apprehend them.
The problem prosecutors had was that if they're going to put together a racketeering conspiracy, the last act had to have taken place within 5 years of the charges being brought. So that was crucial. They had to find some sort of act that fell within that 5-year window. And that's where Steve the accountant's connection to them became important.
I grew up in New Jersey. I got into accounting and went on to work for a CPA firm in New York and eventually bought a place in Las Vegas. In 2002, I was accused of misappropriating or embezzling funds. The FBI raided my office and seized evidence to bring a case against me. But after I met with them, they came back and said, we have an organized crime case, and we would like your help in working undercover, which we feel would help you with your case. I, at that point, called my attorney, who then said, you're not going to do it. You cooperate, you're going to end up getting killed. And I had responded to him that this is my life, I'm going to go forward with the case. So I kept getting calls from this individual who was friends with John Gotti. He said, you really have to meet with this guy because I think you would be great in raising money for him and taking his company public. I drove to his house. He started telling me about his production of movies, that he had written many scripts and he wanted to be able to produce those movies.
The accountant's new friend was Louis Ippolito, still trying to impress with his time as a cop.
He had the wall, and the wall consisted of many medals that he had said he earned at the New York City Police Department, himself in pictures with many actors, many dignitaries. He had told me that he had become the most decorated New York City policeman that New York City had ever seen. Eventually, he brought the person he described as his longtime partner, Steve Caracappa. He was the scariest individual I had ever met. His eyes were almost black. He was very cool, calm. Ippolito, at one point, looked over to a pail that you put a mop in. He said, you know, look at that, Steve. I had one guy that I thought was a rat, and I took his head, I filled that pail up with acid, and I put his head into that pail until all his skin dissolved from his face.
Over the next 2 years, the accountant gained Ippolito's confidence and learned that the 2 retired cops were still taking on jobs. They nearly managed to murder Gambino underboss Sammy the Bull Gravano.
Lou said, yep, we got the contract. And both Steve and I scoped out how we could do the job, but we never had an opportunity to get him alone.
The accountant wore a wire every time he met with Ippolito. And after 2 years of weekly dinners, Steve finally had the ammunition that could bring the mafia cop down on a money laundering charge.
He expressed that he needed money I said, does it matter where the money comes from? And he said, no. And I said, well, this might be drug money. This might be certainly illegal money. And he said that I don't care. As long as I get the money to fund my movies, I don't care where it comes. After that, the FBI called me and said that they would arrange for the money to be wired from a fictitious company to Lou Ippolito the next day. Within a couple of days, the DEA sent the money to his account.
It was the break that investigators were waiting for. When Ippolito accepted the cash on behalf of the two detectives, it was enough to bring them down.
We took that evidence and obtained arrest warrants, and the detectives and agents had a very complex and detailed plan for how they were going to be apprehended, because we knew that they may very well understand the moment they see the DEA and the FBI coming for them, that they might realize that everything was over.
On March 9th, the FBI agents asked me to make a dinner reservation at a restaurant in Las Vegas called Piero's. Agents would be there. They would arrest Caracappa and Lou Ippolito as they entered the restaurant. So that night I went to dinner at a different restaurant. And at around 7:30, my phone starts to ring off the hook. And they were calling to say, it's a big scene here, where are you? It crossed my mind that I could get killed.
Retired detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa thought they'd gotten away with murder, and they had, for nearly 25 years. But a secret informant and a 2-year investigation by the DEA, the Brooklyn DA's office, and the FBI finally threatened to bring them down.
My phone starts to ring off the hook from many people at the restaurant who knew I was very close to both Ippolito and Caracappa, and they were calling to say, your two friends, your buddies, just got arrested. It's a big scene here, where are you?
I get a call from my mom, and she was really upset. She's like, Louis, I gotta tell you something. Your father was arrested, him and his partner Steve out there in Vegas, and you better go check the news and see what's going on.
2 former New York City Police Department detectives were arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada on racketeering charges. Ippolito and Caracappa were partners with the mob. And with this indictment, they will rightfully be brought to justice.
It was probably the biggest scandal in the history of the NYPD.
The two men were brought back to the place where all their crimes began, New York. The charges: racketeering, obstruction of justice, extortion, and 8 counts of murder and conspiracy. Burt Kaplan was the star witness.
He was completely unshakable, absolutely matter-of-fact at all times, totally unemotional. His range of recall and detail was astonishing.
The trial lasted 3 weeks and riveted the entire city.
The thing I remember most about Kaplan's testimony was when he was asked by the prosecution, what did you do with the defendants? And his answer was, I paid them. Louis Ippolito and Caracappa were getting a retainer of about $4,000 a month to provide information. Later, when they started to do assassinations and hits, they were getting $35,000, $40,000, $75,000.
Some of Kaplan's most shocking testimony was about the case of Israel Greenwald, a man with a very different background than the other victims of the corrupt cops.
The Greenwald case was really a terrible tragedy in that he really had no connection to anything, certainly not the mafia.
My father, Israel Greenwald, was always an entrepreneur-type personality. He became very successful, at a very young age, dealing with diamonds as well as other different business ventures. In the 80s, there was a big scheme where the mafia was getting their hands on these bonds, and there was no way to trace them. Once you had them in your hand, it was as good as having cash. And all you had to do is deposit in a bank, and there was no way to trace it really or know where it came from. My father unwittingly took a bond. He believed it was a legitimate bond belonging to his friend who asked him for a favor, and he went and deposited it. And it turned out that bond was a stolen bond. And then he was stopped by the FBI. And they said, "We're aware that you did this. Where did you get these bonds from?" And my father said, "I got it from a friend." And that was when my father was officially considered a witness. And at that point, my father realized, what did I get myself into? According to my mother, he went to his rabbi to ask the rabbi for advice. He said, "It looks as if my friend, a Jewish person, gave me something that may be stolen. And they want me to basically tape record him admitting to giving it to me, and what do I do?" So the advice that the rabbi gave was, you can't put a friend in jail. You have to tell your friend what happened and let the friend come clean. So when the FBI was asking my father to tell on another Jew, a Jew that my father had no clue was involved with the mafia, my father, rather than tell on him, instead he warned his friend.
It was Greenwald's loyalty to his friend that put him on the mafia's hit list and ultimately cost him his life.
During the trial, Kaplan said my father was driving on the Belt Parkway on his way to work, and Caracappa and Ippolito pulled him over under the premise that he hit somebody and drove off. And they said, "We need you to come to the station because somebody's accusing you of hitting them and running away." My father, being a law-abiding citizen, said, "Oh, well, I didn't do it, but of course," and willingly left his car and went into the car of the cops.
He was brought to a parking garage in Brooklyn where Frankie Santoro was waiting for him. He was killed inside the parking garage by Frankie Santoro.
Ippolito and Caracappa's willingness to lure Greenwald into a death trap was the ultimate betrayal of the cops' code of honor.
My father never would have just gone into someone's car. He would have suspected anyone. This was the perfect way to get him.
Witness after witness painted a devastating picture of two greedy men who cared more about money than the citizens they were sworn to protect.
So as the trial's going on, it made it tougher for me to have a conversation with my dad, because now he's denying it. I'm starting not to believe the denials. He would swear I have tapes back home in my house in Vegas. They're sitting in my garage. I have tapes that prove I'm innocent. I'm like, "Dad, why aren't the tapes here? If you're innocent, why don't you have everything here?" "Oh, I'm gonna get it. My lawyers are gonna get it."
What do you think's going through the mind of the jurors right now?
I think they're looking at us as not guilty.
Oh, you do?
Yes.
What do you think? What gives you that confidence?
There's no evidence in the case at all.
As I started to really believe what I was hearing in the trial, I actually felt more bad for my father, because now I'm thinking, you're not going to beat this.
Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa told the judge they were innocent.
We were very confident, but anything can happen in the U.S. jury system.
After 4 weeks of devastating testimony, federal agents were confident of their case against mafia cops Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa.
We had in excess of 50 witnesses, and all that information was brought out during the testimony.
But after living a double life for more than 20 years, Ippolito and Caracappa weren't ready to go down without a fight. Caracappa went on TV to make his case to the public.
I was a New York City detective for 23 years. We don't go around killing people.
Caracappa says he's also speaking for his friend and co-defendant, Louis Ippolito.
He's not the monster that the newspapers portrayed him to be. But we'll put up the evidence to show that we couldn't have done these crimes. We just couldn't have done it.
To defend them, the Mafia cops chose lawyers Bruce Cutler and Eddie Hayes. Cutler was famous for successfully defending John Gotti for nearly 17 years.
We also were facing two extremely experienced defense attorneys. They were particularly well-versed and experienced in the New York City crime and underworld, and what's an effective way to try those types of cases.
I think there's a flaw in it, a terrible flaw in the case, and I think if the flaw is exposed the way we as lawyers know how to do it, and it's shown to Judge Weinstein to be an irreparable flaw, he will dismiss the case.
But the evidence at trial was ironclad. There was no way for the attorneys to explain why they had these relationships with so many organized crime figures. There was no way to explain this wave of terror that took place over a dozen years as anything like a coincidence or the mountain of evidence and corroboration that we had gathered against them. The main point we wanted to make to the jury was that these were murderers, killers who conspired together to kill over a half a dozen people.
After only 10 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict.
2 former New York City police detectives have been sentenced to life behind bars after being convicted of racketeering and 8 murders carried out while they were moonlighting as hitmen for the mob.
Louis Ippolito was convicted of every single charge in the indictment. Stephen Caracapo was convicted of every single charge in the indictment.
I still felt the pain, and I wished that all of that never happened.
20 years of pain, thinking of what's going on, what happened. Now we finally got closure. It's about time.
And it was like 70-something counts, and every one, my heart just dropped. I saw my father, I just looked at my dad. He was like pale as a ghost, and I'm like, I can't believe this is happening.
Judge Weinstein sentenced both of them to multiple life terms.
In comparison to some of the other police corruption scandals I reported on over the years, the Mafia Cops case was clearly the most important. It also was the most serious. Not only did the 2 cops take money, but they also carried out murder contracts.
It was his ego that caused him to be convicted. And by writing a book titled Mafia Cop, that's pretty much what got this case going.
Caracapo only served 7 years of his sentence. He died of cancer in prison in 2017. Ippolito lived 2 years longer before dying of unspecified causes.
There's so many things I would love to ask my dad. One of the big things was, why did you do this? Why? I mean, you're gonna say the money? Why did you hurt so many people?
The question of why Louis Ippolito did what he did is an interesting question. Certainly, I think Ippolito led this schizophrenic existence early in his life. He saw the kind of loyalty and the drama that the life of organized crime provided. He was a cop on the one hand. On the other hand, he had this mentality that the mafia wasn't all bad.
Did he become a cop knowing he wanted to do good for people and be a good police officer, or did he become a cop knowing he could, do this stuff on the side? I don't know. But I just don't know how a family man or woman or anybody can do such horrible things.